Hello friends and neighbors. So last year it was announced that Harper Lee, after over 50 years since publishing her American classic To Kill a Mockingbird, was going to be releasing another book called Go Set a Watchman, which was marketed as a sequel to Kill a Mockingbird, but was in actuality the first draft of To Kill a Mockingbird. Because Harper Lee had only written the one book, and it was a well-beloved book, this was a very highly anticipated release, which was pretty negatively received. So this is my take on the book, and right off the bat I'm just gonna say that it's really difficult to review this book without comparing it to Kill a Mockingbird, so I'm not even gonna try, and there are a couple of reasons why I'm choosing to do that. First of all, the story of Go Set a Watchman is so wrapped up in the plot of To Kill a Mockingbird that they really are companions of each other, and it's actually kind of hard for Go Set a Watchman to stand on its own without To Kill a Mockingbird to bolster it. You almost need to have read To Kill a Mockingbird to really understand the story that Go Set a Watchman is trying to tell. But also you have to understand where Go Set a Watchman came from. Harper Lee wrote Go Set a Watchman as the first draft of what would eventually become To Kill a Mockingbird, and when I read Go Set a Watchman, I had the same basic reaction to it that the original publishers did. It's a good book, it's got a lot of potential, but it needs a lot of work. So to say that Go Set a Watchman just isn't as good as To Kill a Mockingbird is kind of obvious. It's not supposed to be. To Kill a Mockingbird is what Go Set a Watchman became after it was improved upon. Of course it's better. So really the whole question of this book is not whether or not it's a good story or a bad story, but whether this first draft should have been published in the first place. And I'm not going to get into the whole controversy of whether or not Harper Lee actually wanted it to be published or anything like that, because I really don't know anything about it. I'm just going to look at the story itself and see, was it good enough to be published? So, yeah, Go Set a Watchman reads like a first draft. It's not terribly polished, the writing style is kind of inconsistent, the characters aren't terribly interesting, the dialogue is often kind of clunky. There are passages of the book that I had to read 2 or 3 times before I fully understood what it was she was trying to say. And while the story does have a lot going for it, and it does have an interesting premise, it's not really enough to sustain the entire book. The story doesn't really get going until it's revealed that Atticus is essentially a racist. That's when the story really gets going and becomes interesting. The first few chapters of the book really kind of drag and don't really have a plot to speak of, but then to be fair, the first few chapters of To Kill a Mockingbird don't really have a plot to speak of either. That's actually part of the book's appeal for me. But all that being said, there is a reason why this book was published separately from To Kill a Mockingbird, and that's because this book does offer something that To Kill a Mockingbird doesn't. One of the biggest criticisms I see for To Kill a Mockingbird is the fact that Atticus Finch is a very unrealistically idealized character, that in that place and that time he would not have been as against racism and pro-African American as he is portrayed in that story. And I think that this story does kind of act as a response to those comments, because the character of Atticus Finch really hasn't changed. It's not as though he just woke up one morning and decided he was going to be racist. He's still Atticus Finch, and you can tell that when you see that last argument that he and Jean Louise have at the end of the book. He's still Atticus Finch. He's still arguing in the same way that he argued the Tom Robinson case. But the thing to remember about his argument in the Tom Robinson case is that he was not making it based on the fact that he believed in equality between African Americans and white Americans. He made it based on the fact that he believed that Tom Robinson was a human being who deserved fair treatment based on the evidence and based on the law, and that's what he was going off of. And really, that's what this story is about. In the end, it's about disillusionment. It's about that feeling that I think everyone has gone through at some point in their life, when they are forced to grow up and look at something from their childhood, whether it be their parents or their hometown or something that they grew up with, and view it as it really is, and view it with all of its flaws and everything that is imperfect about it, and force themselves to reconcile that with the nostalgia that they viewed it with as a child. Our parents are not paradigms of virtue. We realize that at some point in our lives. We realize that they are not perfect and that they are as fundamentally flawed as the rest of the world. But the thing is, Jean Louise never really went through that until she went home in this story when she was 26. And I think that's the one thing that To Kill a Mockingbird really doesn't have. It doesn't have really closure for Jean Louise's character growth because she's a child throughout the entire thing. She doesn't really have dramatic character growth in the way that, say, Jem does. And Ghost of the Watchman gives her that growth. It gives her that moment when she has to become disillusioned with everything that she knows. I've seen a lot of reviewers kind of talk about how this book should be read by students of literature to see how a first draft can be molded into an American classic, and I agree with that to a certain extent, but I also think that that's kind of dismissive of what this book is offering. I'm not saying the book is perfect by any means. It's very flawed, and I definitely think that you shouldn't read this book without having read To Kill a Mockingbird. You have to have those two together. But at the same time, I do think that this book was published for a reason other than just interest, and I think that reason is that the book does have something to offer that To Kill a Mockingbird doesn't. And for that reason, I do think that it's a good book to read alongside To Kill a Mockingbird. I think it acts as a really, really great companion for the book, even if it doesn't stand on its own as well. So on the worth meter, I would give this one a worth borrowing. Is it on the same level as To Kill a Mockingbird? No, of course not. It's not supposed to be. But it's a worthwhile read nonetheless. And that's it for this review. Hopefully I'm going to have some more reviews of this type where I just kind of talk about books and movies that I've read or I've seen and just kind of keep it simple for a little while I'm working on some more complicated things. So until next time, I'll see you later.